Imagine, because it's already happening.
2 years ago, I questioned, are we sleepwalking into a surveillance society? Now I have to say, I think we are waking up to a surveillance society. All of us in our daily lives leave an electronic footprint. Everything we do now with our mobile phones, our credit cards, walking down the streets with cameras everywhere, it means that we're being watched, information is being collected.
And when it comes to the commercial world, knowledge is not only power, it can also spell profits. In the future, customers will be targeted the very second they walk into shops. Scanners will pick out the brand of clothing they're wearing, alerting staff to what type of products they might be interested in.
It's easy to get spooked when you see just how big these databases are going to be. But I think it's important to distinguish between where there's a problem, which is where information is collected in ways we don't know and is used in ways over which we have no control, and where there isn't so much of a problem.
Researchers also predict spy planes observing us from the skies, while global positioning satellites will be able to track vehicle movements and mileage. Tiny cameras embedded in lampposts will be capable of recognising faces at street level. Computer software will be able to build a 3D image. So where will this thirst for information about the private lives of the general public end? And do they really care?
I'll be a lot more paranoid now. I'll be walking thinking, who's watching me, who's watching me, who's watching me.
It can work both ways. It can work for advantage and it can work to a disadvantage. If you've got something to hide, then it can work against you. If you haven't got nothing to hide, then it will work with you.
I just think people just know far too much about us.
CCTV footage has proved invaluable to police investigations. This image captured the moment in 1993 when murdered toddler Jamie Bulger was abducted on Merseyside. But research has shown it doesn't actually reduce crime. That's unlikely to deter those in favour of even more cameras, though the reality is we already inhabit a surveillance society, and most of us don't even know we're being watched. Enda Brady, Sky News.
One of the points made by many of our emailers today is this one. What have you got to fear if you're a law-abiding citizen? Let's put that and other points to Graham Gerrard. He's Deputy Chief Constable of Cheshire Police. He's in our Manchester studio. Good evening too to our Central London studio, David Carr. He's a solicitor and describes himself as a libertarian. Graham Gerrard, do we have anything to fear?
Well, can I first of all say I welcome the debate that Richard Thomas has started. I think it's very much overdue. And his concern, and I share his concern, is in relation to the unregulated, the unsupervised surveillance that there is about in this country. Most of the surveillance that the police use, in fact all of the surveillance that the police use, certainly the unseen surveillance, is properly authorised, it's proportionate and it's necessary, otherwise we wouldn't get it authorised in the first place.
When you say the unauthorised, what do you mean by that?
Well, there are lots of organisations, individuals even, who are allowed to use or are using surveillance in all sorts of shapes and forms that aren't regulated by anybody whatsoever. The police use of surveillance is regulated by the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, by the Human Rights Act, by the Data Protection Act and ultimately by the courts. But there are lots of other people who are using surveillance who aren't regulated at all.
But just to understand that, I mean, if a private citizen puts up a CCTV camera system in a convenience store, if there's a robbery there, you guys go and ask for the tape, don't you? That's okay, surely.
Well, we do indeed, yes, although that use of surveillance ought to be protected or come under the Data Protection Act. But yes, we will make use of the tape.
Well, just to be clear, if it's unlicensed, he hasn't asked permission to put the system up, is that evidence inadmissible in a court?
That's a matter for the court to determine. Our job is to acquire the evidence and present it before the courts. At the moment, the courts aren't turning many of these down.
David Carr, what have we got to fear if we're law-abiding?
Well, I think if we're law-abiding, we have quite a lot to fear, perhaps not individually, but I think collectively as a society. I think we ought to be asking ourselves what kind of society we're building here. We are already subjected to an apparatus of surveillance and monitoring that the KGB and the Gestapo would have envied. I think the long-term effects of this are something that we all have to fear. I think it leads to a breakdown in trust. I think it leads to a more suspicious society. I think it leads to a more hostile society and a breakdown in civil society. Civil society is based on trust. And if those things are gradually eroded, I think that that can have very alarming consequences in the long term that I think we should all be frightened of.
What evidence do you have for that is happening, this breakdown in trust which you fear so much?
Well, specific cases are very difficult to point to. For example, though, on your own news item this evening, the extent of ASBOs among young people and the extent to which this is becoming not a mark of shame but a badge of honour. Another report on your station this evening claims that we have the worst behaved young people in Europe, the most drunken, the most likely to get the most likely to get pregnant while teenage, the most likely to get involved in criminal activity. If the surveillance society was supposed to protect us from all of this, and I'm afraid it's manifestly failed, hasn't it?
Graham Gerrard, has it failed?
Well, certainly the police use of CCTV has actually allowed us to take some very dangerous people off the streets. In doing so, I think we've made people a lot safer. Most of the CCTV, certainly the public space CCTV in this country, is owned and managed by local authorities. It's put in place because the local people want it. It's not necessarily put there because the police have asked for it. So certainly as far as the general public are concerned, there's a huge amount of support for CCTV.
David Carr, are you saying that, I mean, if people really felt strongly about not being photographed so much, they would avoid places where the photography is overt and well publicised? For instance, the local shopping centre. People just wouldn't go there. Well, that's not the case, is it? People are quite happy to shop and be filmed shopping.
Well, I'm afraid that the extent and scope of camera surveillance, and I understand that microphone surveillance is now in the pipeline. I don't know too much about it, but the extent and scope of it make it very difficult to live any sort of sophisticated life while avoiding it. So there may be people, and I hope there are people out there who feel uncomfortable at this level of surveillance, but if you want to do everyday domestic duties like go shopping or go to a supermarket or go to a gym or a sports centre, then I'm afraid it's very difficult to avoid you unless you shut yourself in your own room. So while I think that, and I hope that there are people who are questioning this, it's very difficult for them to take proactive steps to avoid it. But ultimately, of course, I think the responsibility for this kind of society rests not with people like Deputy Chief Constable Gerrard, but I think ultimately with the British public.
Would you try and wind the clock back then, David Carr, and take away some of this technology?
No, you can't take away technology, and there's nothing wrong with the technology. The problem comes with the uses to which that technology is put. This idea of a panopticon state where we're all being watched is manifestly not making us safer. And I think that I'm more concerned, unlike Deputy Chief Constable Gerrard, I'm more concerned about these surveillance powers in the hands of the state. After all, private property owners and shopkeepers don't have coercive powers. The government does.
Peter Brearley is a viewer. He happens to be, Peter, I think, an operator of this kind of kit as your day job, right?
That's right, yeah. And what the Chief Constable is saying about the regulation, to be able to operate this equipment now, you have to have a licence, you have police checks, you have to have a licence. And the other thing is, we don't actually watch people. We wouldn't, if we saw somebody walking past the front of our camera, we know that that's a gentleman, that's a lady, but we don't know who they are, and we wouldn't know who they are. It's there for safety. It's also there for things like road information. It's there for things like we've been involved in, like sending ambulances to accidents, things like that. It's not only, we don't sit there watching people all day, just watching people for the sake of watching people.
Let me put a comment which Colin has made to us by email to the Deputy Chief Constable, if I may, Mr Gerrard. CCTV no doubt has its uses, says Colin, but it's a poor substitute for officers on the beat. It might be my imagination, but there seems to be many fewer police officers visible in our town centres these days. Is that a charge you've had to face before, and is it right?
Well, whether or not there are many fewer, but I suspect there probably are fewer police officers, and that's because most of them are driving around going from one incident to the next as a result of the people ringing us up. So yes, I mean, I would like, most of us would like more police officers, but the reality is we can't afford to put a lot more extra police officers on the ground.
You've got record numbers now, haven't you?
We have record numbers, but then we have record numbers of incidents that we're trying to deal with as well. And we're trying to deal with with a society that I think, certainly in terms of the amount of alcohol that is consumed, that is causing so much more trouble than it has in the past. So our police officers are very pressed, certainly in the town centres. But CCTV does allow us to get to incidents very quickly. I think that in turn minimises the amount of violence that takes place. It does still clearly take place, but I think it helps us get there to stop it. And it helps us to identify the offenders. And if we can manage to prosecute dangerous offenders, then I think that's got to make people safer.
David Carl, I'm reminded actually or chastised indeed by another text saying, look, most people, a majority of people are not villains, they haven't got ASBOs and they don't misbehave, they lead quite decent lives.